Right now, somewhere, a 7-year-old is sitting at a desk, hand raised, waiting for permission to speak. It happens so often, in so many classrooms, that it doesn't even register as strange anymore. It's just what childhood is. What if it wasn't? What if your entire childhood, every single day of it, was built around an assumption that's actually only a few hundred years old? Not this. Not a classroom you didn't choose. Not a curriculum designed by strangers. Not 12 years of sitting still, raising your hand, waiting for a bell to tell you when you're allowed to move. But this. A 5-year-old barefoot, walking beside her mother at sunrise, off to dig roots from the earth with a stick she sharpened herself. No bell. No test. No one telling her she's behind. For 95% of human history, this, not the classroom, was childhood. So what did childhood actually look like for nearly all of human history? Before the first bell ever rang, you'd assume that ancient childhood was mostly survival, grim, laborious, over almost as soon as it began. Kids forced into adult work the moment they could walk, no time to be young. But actually, the anthropological record tells a very different story. Among hunter-gatherer societies studied across the 20th and 21st centuries, groups whose lifestyles closely mirror our Paleolithic ancestors, children under the age of 10 spend the overwhelming majority of their day in something researchers have a hard time calling anything other than play. David Lancy, an anthropologist at Utah State University, who has spent decades comparing childhood across cultures, has documented that in foraging societies, children are rarely assigned formal tasks before age 6 or 7. Before that, they mimic, they wander, they build tiny, useless things and destroy them and build them again. It looks like idleness. It wasn't. For decades, researchers studying the Hadza of Tanzania, one of the last living hunter-gatherer populations on Earth, assumed that children were essentially bystanders to adult food gathering, cute but economically irrelevant, a mouth to feed, not a hand that helped. Then, anthropologist Alyssa Crittenden at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, started actually weighing what the children brought home, not what adults said the kids did, what they physically carried back to camp. In a 2013 study published in Evolution and Human Behavior, Crittenden and her colleagues, including longtime Hadza researcher Frank Marlowe, documented that Hadza children as young as 5 were returning with baobab fruit, berries, and small game. And that, above the age of 5, they were collecting between 25 and 50% of their own daily caloric needs, not because they were forced to, because digging, climbing, and foraging alongside adults simply was their play. The assumption collapsed. These weren't kids being trained for some distant future. They were already quietly useful in the present. Picture a girl. We'll never know her real name, but children exactly like her left evidence behind that outlasted them by tens of thousands of years. Crouched at the edge of a dry riverbed, sometime around 40,000 years ago. She's maybe 6 years old. She isn't being taught. No adult stands over her shoulder. She's watched her mother do this 100 times. And now she's trying it herself. Turning over a flat stone, hunting for the pale grubs hiding underneath. She flips one stone, nothing. She flips another. A grub, pale and wriggling, and she laughs, actually laughs, a small sound swallowed by the wind, before popping it straight into her mouth. No one applauds her, no one grades her. She simply learned in that instant something about which stones hold food and which don't. Then she moves to the next stone, and the next. This isn't a guess about how ancient children learned in general. It's a documented pattern. Developmental psychologist Barbara Rogoff at the University of California, Santa Cruz, spent decades studying how children in indigenous and traditional communities acquire skills, formalizing what she calls intent participation. Her research found that in communities where children are folded into adult activity, rather than segregated from it, learning happens primarily through keen observation and direct pitching in, not through formal instruction, testing, or reward. The girl at the riverbed isn't an isolated image. She's the pattern Rogoff documented, played out, one stone at a time. This is the entire architecture of ancient education: repetition, curiosity, consequence, and with joy sitting quietly at the center of it, not as a reward for learning, but as the mechanism of it. You'd assume that Paleolithic parenting was harsh out of necessity, that with mortality rates high and resources scarce, ancient parents had no room for gentleness. That discipline had to be severe to keep children alive. But actually, cross-cultural research on remaining forager societies, including decades of fieldwork by anthropologist Barry Hewlett at Washington State University, Vancouver, among the aka people of Central Africa, found something closer to the opposite. Physical punishment was rare. Children were almost never left crying for long. In Hewlett's research, Aka fathers were found to be in physical contact with their infants for roughly 47% of daylight hours, a level of paternal closeness far exceeding most industrialized societies today. The harshness we imagine wasn't a feature of ancient parenting. It's a projection, us assuming that scarcity must equal cruelty, when the evidence points toward radical physical closeness as the ancient survival strategy, not distance and discipline. Here's why this actually matters to you right now. Today, in 2011, developmental psychologist Peter Gray, one of the most cited researchers on play and child development, then at Boston College, published research in the American Journal of Play, linking the decades-long decline in children's free, unsupervised play since the 1950s to measurable rises in childhood anxiety and depression. Gray's argument isn't sentimental nostalgia, it's structural. Ancient children spent their formative years in mixed age groups, self-directed, with minimal adult intervention, the exact conditions modern research keeps circling back to as ideal for resilience and social development. We didn't remove play because it stopped working. We removed it because industrial society needed children in seats, learning standardized material on standardized time. Our entire modern model of childhood, school, structure, constant supervision is the historical anomaly, not the natural state of the species, the anomaly. You'd assume ancient children had nothing. No toys, no objects of their own, nothing but rocks and sticks in a hostile landscape. But actually, the archaeological record disagrees. Once you know where to look, which took a surprisingly long time to figure out. For years, miniature stone tools found at some Paleolithic sites were cataloged as failed adult tools, rejects, or ritual objects, too small, too crude for real use. Paleolithic archaeologist April Nowell at the University of Victoria has spent much of the last 15 years challenging that assumption. In her 2021 book Growing Up in the Ice Age, Nowell reviews wear pattern analysis from multiple sites, showing that some of these smaller tools carry use wear consistent not with adult hands, but with the grip patterns and softer materials a child would practice on. They weren't failures. They were practice tools, the Paleolithic equivalent of training wheels, scaled down for small hands still learning to nap stone. Children weren't excluded from tool-making culture. They were folded into it, playfully, years before they'd need the skill to survive. You'd assume that in a world with such brutal infant mortality, ancient societies couldn't afford to be sentimental about children, that kids were essentially disposable until proven they'd survive. But actually, burial evidence says otherwise. And it's some of the most quietly devastating evidence in the entire archaeological record. At Sungir in Russia, excavated originally by archaeologist Otto Bader and dated to roughly 34,000 years ago, archaeologists uncovered the burial of two children, laid head to head, covered in thousands of painstakingly carved ivory beads, each one estimated to take over an hour to make. Thousands of hours of collective labor poured into honoring two children's deaths, by some estimates, more labor than was invested in the adult buried nearby. This wasn't a society that treated childhood as disposable. This was a society that treated it as worth a mountain of communal effort to mourn. And this is the piece of evidence that should stay with you. Among the grave goods at that same site, alongside the beads and the mammoth ivory spears, far too large for a child to have used, archaeologists also found smaller, carved ivory objects, including at least one shaped like a horse. Not a weapon, not a tool. Carved with care, for no survival purpose anyone has ever identified. Buried alongside a child. 34,000 years before anyone would write the word toy down. 34,000 years before anyone would study play in a laboratory. Someone who loved that child carved it by hand, knowing it served no practical purpose, and placed it in the ground anyway. Because some part of what that child needed in life clearly wasn't just food and warmth. It was something to hold, something to imagine with. That instinct, to give a child something just to spark their imagination, isn't a modern invention. The evidence for it is 34,000 years old, and it might be one of the oldest expressions of human love we've ever found. So no, ancient childhood wasn't a grim, joyless slog toward adulthood. It was mixed-age play, practice tools scaled for small hands, and a physical closeness we've since engineered out of modern parenting. It was David Lancy's wandering toddlers, Alyssa Crittenden's foraging 5-year-olds, Barbara Rogoff's quiet observers, April Nowell's tiny worked flints, and a carved ivory horse that outlasted the civilization that made it. Look at that bedroom again. The glowing screen, the backpack by the door. Now picture her, barefoot, unsupervised, flipping stones at the edge of a river 40,000 years ago, already halfway to being everything her community needed her to become, without ever once being told to sit down and pay attention. 2 childhoods. Only one of them has existed for most of human history. Maybe the real question was never what ancient children did all day. Maybe it's what we quietly gave up. If you made it this far, you are exactly the kind of person this channel exists for. We make videos like this one every week about ancient human behavior, about what your body still remembers, and about the gap between the world you were built for and the one you actually live in. If that is something you want more of, hit subscribe. It costs you nothing, and it tells the algorithm that this kind of storytelling is worth keeping alive. And if you want to see what happened when this childhood ended, when farming, cities, and the first schools arrived and changed children forever, that's coming next.